for the CISO to come in and to look at these relationships, this baselining, this visibility, I always think in 30, 60, 90-day plans, right? It's good to have concrete goals when you're walking into a new role so that you don't lose your way, but also as an executive, you don't come in and push down too hard too soon with some biases. You don't walk in day one and say, at my last company, we did zero trust, so my project for the next 60 days is zero trust, without first, maybe getting a feel for reasons why that may not be the case or may not fit that specific business.
O3C Cybersecurity Podcast.
Hey, we're back. Welcome to the O3 Cloud Security Podcast. My name is Håkon Sørum, and I'm going to be your host for today. So for today's episode, we are going to discuss something that's very interesting and exciting: cloud security strategy. It should probably be the first place you start when you move to the cloud and want to secure your workloads. And for the episode, we have two great guests. So the first guest, I was thinking, I'm doing a cloud security, cloud strategy podcast. Who do I need to have on? Well, there's this guy. I've seen a lot of his talks. I've read a lot of his blogs, and they are amazing. I'm influenced by his work. So I was like, I need to ask him to be on the podcast. So with no further ado, Rami McCarthy, welcome to the episode.
Thank you for having me and for the kind feedback.
And on the other side here, we have a familiar face. Olav Østbye, welcome back to your own podcast.
Thank you very much, Håkon. Thank you.
So, Rami, what's your background? How did you get into cloud security, and what do you do today?
Yeah, let's tell the story. Why don't we? So, I actually got started in security academically, which I think is becoming more common these days, especially in the States. I don't know about in Europe, but it used to be that everyone came up through like the hacker scene or being in IT or a sysadmin. And when I was going through university, I was actually able to do a security concentration as part of a computer science degree, get connected right into working at a boutique security consultancy in Boston. This was a little consultancy called VSR where we did penetration testing, security consulting, a lot of working with financial firms, a lot of working with Boston area, some of the bigger enterprises. And we got acquired and rolled up into NCC Group, which is a big UK-based multinational consulting behemoth. And there are pros and cons of getting acquired and rolled up into a bigger company. I think we experienced both. The upside was that NCC got very interesting work from every company you've ever heard of. And at the time I was joining NCC, they were really trying to re-envision how they served customers around cloud security. NCC had a huge history in cloud security. Scout Suite is an open source CSPM, still around today, but at the time, I think it was really outperforming many of the closed source options back in the early days of cloud. And that was actually their second run at a CSPM. They had previously done a version called Scout. So NCC Group had this like reputation as a cloud security consultancy through these tools. And then it turned out that when we, came down to the wire on doing pen testing, on doing engagements, no one really knew what to do beyond the configuration findings. And that was true across the industry at the time, right? Like we still find that many cloud pen tests are insufficient. And they're just focusing on single misconfigurations instead of actually looking at holistic risks and architecture. And so I got to be part of a working group that we put together to re-envision cloud security services. And as part of that, I dug deep into cloud. I met folks like Scott Piper, who you've had on before. I got involved in Forward CloudSec and the Cloud Security Forum. And within a couple of years, I had left consultancy to go in-house at a startup. And so I sort of transitioned from this journey in consultancy and pen testing in the US, I would say, and specific to this pen testing oriented short-term engagement culture, where it felt like I was coming in and punching people in the mouth and then leaving for a year. And if I was lucky, I'd come back a year later and find like 80% overlapping issues. I didn't have the satisfaction of growing a program, seeing the maturity curve. When we look at cloud security, for many years, I think professionals have been frustrated by seeing the same problems over and over. Exposed S3 buckets for years were like this bane of we're doing really cool security work, and then also the news is just focused on this one misconfiguration that is hard to get right, frankly, at the time. And that was even worse when you were going in and getting paid consultancy day rates to tell clients over and over to take their S3 buckets off the internet. It just wasn't the most satisfying version of doing security work for me. Great experience, met amazing people, learned a ton. Moved in-house for a health tech startup where I was effectively the second security hire, working with Aaron Zolman, who is one of the Forward CloudSec founders and frequent MC. So Aaron was kind enough to rescue me from consulting mills and turned me into a real security professional. And so there we built this team and program from 150 people at the company to 800 through a Series D at a health tech. Security team grew from 2 to 8. And I had a chance to do a bit of everything. So I started off in cloud and product security, application security, a little bit of pen testing management, because I'd done that before, working with external contractors, consultants. And then by the end of it, I was managing a few people. I was a staff engineer. I was working as part of our architecture review board across the whole company. So it's just this great learning experience, seeing how the rubber meets the road in trying to fix things. It was a huge realization. I like to think of myself as an empathetic consultant, where I would go into companies and I wouldn't be dumb enough to say things like, just remove all of those open security groups, right? I knew that there was like business processes, Chesterton's fence, but I still didn't quite get it because I'd never lived it. And so coming in-house and seeing that like, oh, there's no way we can rotate that key without taking the whole app down for 30 minutes. And when was the last time the app ever went down for 30 minutes? And does security really want to be the PL to break that streak? In this case, we were doing payment processing for healthcare. And so like downtime has very clear monetary costs you can draw, and it's really hard to motivate changes that require downtime. And so it was just this exercise in learning the sharp edges of doing some of these things in the real world. And when I hopped from Cedar, I went to Figma because Figma had this, I think, really well-regarded, in my opinion, security team, really much larger team. The company was about the same size with a security team about twice as large. And so it was a chance to have a bigger pool to swim in, more people to learn from. Funny enough, I got the Figma job through CloudSec Forum. One of the Figma infrastructure security engineers had spoken at Forward CloudSec, and they'd posted the job in CloudSec Forum when it came live. And so the story of my career has been sort of woven through CloudSec Forum and Forward CloudSec. And at Figma, I was working in the infrastructure security program, but at a much bigger scale. And so the journey has been consulting, real world, and then scale. And all of it touching cloud and seeing how cloud has evolved through the research perspective. Beyond my work at, starting at NCC Group, there was this huge push to do research and a really excellent culture of mentorship and growth around research practices. And this is really hard to find. When I talk to folks who are just starting out and see that, like, I write a lot of blog posts or speak at conferences and they're wondering how to get started, I was just in this environment where it was encouraged and normalized to go off into the wilderness a bit and, maybe pair with someone more senior on a project, give you a chance to get your feet under you. Clint Gibler was a research director at the time. He now has TLDRSec newsletter. And so got to learn from Clint as part of my first times doing research, among many other fabulous research directors. And having done that at NCC Group, I just kind of kept doing it in little ways as I went in-house. When I was working with Aaron at Cedar, we were trying to grow the team. It turns out that marketing your security team is really powerful if you're trying to get the best people. People really want to understand what they're getting into. And so writing about your program, your values, cool projects you've done is mutually beneficial. And so I did some of that. And then at Figma, there was a long history of an engineering blog that's really wonderful, both inside and outside of security. And so that allowed me to very easily follow that path and take some lessons back to Forward CloudSec. So at Figma, I did a lot of work on IAM and production access, infrastructure access, and I was able to give a talk at Forward CloudSec about that. Similarly, I spent a lot of time thinking about prioritization and strategy and scaling cloud security because we were this company that had done hypergrowth and, had a really good team who were able to invest in having a really top-class security, but didn't want to spend our time on things that weren't going to provide value to the business. And so that turned into this talk I gave recently, how to 10x your cloud security without the Series D, which in fact is a direct ripoff of Clint. Again, these things all rhyme and tie together. That was the journey up till Figma. And then sort of a derailment is I chose to take a year off and go on sabbatical. Great choice, highly recommended to everyone. I got to spend a year traveling, working on things that interested me. I did some consulting. I advised some startups, including in cloud security. And I also, as part of my sabbatical, wrote 35 blog posts, went on a few podcasts, gave a few talks. I was pretty productive, I think, for someone who should have been lying on the couch a bit more. And as part of that journey, I actually moved from Boston in the States to Sweden. And in moving to Sweden, have popped my head back up and have actually just started a new role, joining Wiz as a security researcher, which is a continuation of that thread of research work I've talked about, but also very different experience for me. And it's been really exciting to be helping build a security product and doing research professionally, whereas before the research was always a personal pursuit and the outcomes were always focused on helping secure one company. The reach of Wiz is such that, other researchers from the team have talked about this before publicly, we can either make product changes that impact our customer base, which at this point is, 45% of the Fortune whatever, right? Like just a huge swath of the world is protected if we improve something. Or we can work with the cloud service providers to enact change as well, similarly. So I think it's a opportunity to take the work I've been doing inside companies, bring that perspective into Wiz, like this customer-focused company, bring the practitioner perspective, but then also have a chance to fix things at scale. With consulting, I wasn't fixing anything. I went into companies where I was fixing things for one company and writing research to try and influence, and now there's this chance to really fix things across the industry. And I've been playing with terminology that it's kind of goofy, but I like it, saying I work on security for the internet at Wiz, which is really, I think, manifesting. I would like my role at Wiz to be focused on making security better for everyone, for the internet, because it's important. Wiz thinks that's important too, and they've given me the leeway to do that. And so, keeping that as a North Star as I work at Wiz, making sure I'm continuing to provide like practitioner-focused content, improve the product in ways that meaningfully improve security, and really do things that are high leverage and move the needle. I'm 1 month in, so who knows how it's going, but we'll keep an eye on it, and that's the dream.
What a background, and that's why you're here today. You've both been a consultant, you've been in-house, and now you're at a vendor. So it will be great to get the perspectives from all sides for our discussion. And Olav, you probably don't need an introduction, but what's up? What's up with the outfit?
Oh, my after the last episode, to start with, my mother is probably my biggest fan, so she reads all our articles, all our research, listens to all our podcasts, watch all my vlogs, don't understand anything, but shares it, comments, likes it. So she sent me a message after watching the last podcast episode, Håkon, where you and Kari were in a shirt with a vest on, looking almost like bankers. And she's like, Olav, should I buy you some new shirts when I visit you next week? I'm like, I'm 35 years old. I have 2 kids. I'm working quite hard and doing quite okay, I would say, starting O3C with you guys and also. But my mother still asked the question. I told her, no, I have shirts, but I wear whatever I want to work as long as the client is happy with it, if I'm at the client. So today, Håkon, I have my shirt on, I have my O3 vest, I have my glasses, I shaved, So hopefully my mother is happy now. What do you think, Håkon?
I think she'll be very happy. You look sharp today, Olav, and
Thank you.
I think that will end up being a great episode.
I watched that last episode, and I will tell you guys, I did think, am I supposed to be like wearing a suit, buttoning myself up? And then I thought, no, I'm bringing the like cool hacker perspective. Let's bring the temperature down a little bit on a fashion watch. So
thank you.
I want to know, I noticed that everyone does look spiffy on this podcast.
So diving right into the topic, Rami, you didn't say that you've been a CISO, and I don't think you have been a CISO, but trying to put your CISO hat on. You're a company, you just moved or you're moving to the cloud. How do I approach that? How do I build out a strategy to take my security work that I did on-premise into the cloud?
Yeah, that is a great question of incredibly broad scope. The comment on CISO hat is great because I think with the recent environment, I don't know that I want to have the legal accountability of actually being a CISO, and it's much more fun to just put on the hat occasionally and sort of provide consultation, advice, thought exercise, and with the understanding that it's going to be very different in every environment. You're the context of the business itself, right? If you're at a successful growing business, that's going to be very different than if you're brought in to enact organizational change in a business that's struggling. It's going to be very different than if you're in a business that's been steady state for a while and doesn't have a high change tolerance. If you're in a highly regulated environment, I've worked in health tech where we had to deal with all sorts of privacy and confidentiality and security regulation. I've also worked at Figma in design, where it turns out our customers were incredibly sensitive to security and really sophisticated about it because you had these customers who had never run software in the cloud before. And so, you can be security sensitive for a variety of reasons. And it's important that, like, before we talk about strategy is really specific to your company and your situation. So we'll paint broad strokes here because I'm not just going to hedge and it depends my way through this conversation, but I also acknowledge that someone's going to be in the comments telling me why this doesn't work for their, OT enterprise that's 600 years old and operates entirely on-prem, and I get it. I walk into a new organization with ultimate responsibility for security because that's really what we mean by CISO. And my perspective is always visibility first. And this is not unique to me. This comes back to, like, if you read any security textbook from the past 30 years, it talks about asset inventory. And we've lost and picked back up track of that over the years. But really, it's visibility first. And where this is interesting from the CISO seat to me is that the visibility shouldn't primarily be technical. If you're walking in as a security analyst, it's still visibility first, but it's visibility into your tools, your log sources, your technology stack, maybe your immediate peers. With a security executive role, you really need to be focused on both the organizational and technical. Because if you want to enact change, you have to invest in building relationships. You have to understand the business context. You have to understand the security context. You have to understand the engineering context at many of these companies. And for the CISO to come in and to look at these relationships, this baselining, this visibility, I always think in 30, 60, 90-day plans, right? It's good to have concrete goals when you're walking into a new role so that you don't lose your way, but also as an executive, you don't come in and push down too hard too soon with some biases. You don't walk in day one and say, at my last company, we did zero trust, so my project for the next 60 days is zero trust, without first, maybe getting a feel for reasons why that may not be the case or may not fit that specific business. So visibility first. I had a blog post / conference talk a few years ago called Cloud Security Orienteering, where I actually talk about, like, if I got airdropped in, how would I do the visibility step? But I think it is a matter of this flywheel of breadth and depth. So you want to get a survey of what's out there, right? Like, what cloud providers are we even in? Do we have meaningful SaaS? What's our tech stack like? Are we a monolith or microservices? Are we on Kubernetes? What are these elements that are going to inform where I make my first assumptions on security importance. If I'm on self-managed Kubernetes in the cloud versus on a provider-managed Kubernetes, I already have this intuition about the level of effort. And just to spoil it for folks in case anyone's not aware, generally, if you're self-managing, it's going to be a little more work. There are trade-offs for both. But if I walk into an environment and I hear we're self-managing, I know I'm going to have to spend some time understanding the controls there. If I hear we're using a provider-managed, I can make some assumptions with known defaults that are a little more secure to start with. And so it's that horizontal survey of everything I potentially need to worry about. And then you need to get into the details because, again, there's an altitude you need to work at to be effective when you're talking about strategy. You can't be in every decision. You can't be in every detail. You can't look at the code of everything you build and use. You can't assess every vendor personally. But you do want to get to truth on the ground. And generally, that comes down to priorities. You pick a few things that are so existential that you want to use them as your proof of concept for hands-on understanding. You can use it to build relationships by getting in the weeds with folks you're working with on the security team, by, treating engineers as trusted experts to consult with you. And I think of it in the cloud under a 3 perimeters model. I'm sure I've stolen this from somewhere. I have no original thoughts. Everything I mention, I'm sure, is cobbled together from 6 books and 2 blog posts. So caveat there. I hope that defrays any concerns about plagiarism. But I think about a 3 perimeters model wherever it came from. And in the cloud, for me, that's always been identity, network, and application. And that's what I want to do when I'm building this initial visibility. I want to think about my identity plane, my identity perimeter. This is the cloud management plane. This is how folks are accessing infrastructure. And this is third-party identities. Those are the 3 things that when I walk into an environment and I'm trying to get a feel for the security posture, I'll focus on in the identity perspective. Then we look at the network perimeter. So this is public resources and managed services. Those are your S3 buckets. It's public network access to hosted services. That's what IP addresses do I have on the internet, what's running in them, exposure management. And really, that is where I stop for network. There's a whole lot of complexity and depth to network security, and I don't care about it day 1, day 2, day 3. And the final perimeter is application perimeter. And so this is, what's my vulnerability management posture on the edge, right? Am I running unnamed vendors' edge network devices with CVEs every couple of weeks? Am I running authenticated services with default credentials? Am I running unauthenticated services that probably shouldn't be out there? Am I running my Jenkins on the internet, right? Like these known sensitive platforms in an insecure deployment model. So I think on this perimeter model because security is really critical of M&M security, it's been called, which is like a nice hard perimeter. And then as soon as you get inside, it's gooey. It's easy pickings. When we were in consulting, we'd always do these assumed breach assessments. And it's still very trendy, I think, justifiably, which is if you're going to get value from your consulting, you should give them access and visibility and the ability to pivot, because social engineering will always get you. Malware on an employee laptop will get you. But when you're first starting hardening a new environment, like an M&M is better than nothing. If I have to choose between like Swiss cheese on the edge and an M&M model, I'm going to invest in my perimeter. And so the cloud is different than on-prem just because you do have this publicly exposed identity perimeter. You do have a little bit more of a bias, predisposition, architectural trend to put things internet facing by default because of, the move to COVID meant that people needed to access internal tools. And so you have authentication on them. So you stick them on the edge and then it's hard to pull that back. So I think visibility for everything, focus on the 3 perimeters. And then at some point, you hopefully get to posture and defense. So you have this visibility. Posture is, what are my critical risks? Do I have open S3 buckets? Do I have RDP on the internet? What are the ways that people are actually getting breached that I'm susceptible to here that I can fix with, high return on investment? And that is a cycle. So you go to 0 critical risks. But then really look at your high risks, look at your toxic combinations, look at things like privileged identities tied to vulnerable workloads in context. that together leave you vulnerable to sort of immediate risk of breach or incident. And then you can go into defense, which is where I start to think about monitoring, detection, response. Do I have an IR plan? Have I done a tabletop? Where are my logs going? Again, this is meant to be very pragmatic. I don't want to say that, like, if you're in a mature organization, you should roll back your defense program to focus on visibility. That's not the question. The question is, when I airdrop in, at the end of the day, if I invest in centralizing CloudTrail, I am taking an approach that is risk deferment post-compromise versus doing everything I can to prevent compromise. And I think in the cloud security ecosystem, given the types of compromises we see for the average organization, it's worth hardening your perimeter because so many attacks these days are commodity attacks that are untargeted. And so unless, like the traditional threat model of Mossad versus not Mossad, are you a target for nation state, highly sophisticated or not? Most of us are not. And if you're not, then you should focus on not having those sort of commodity attacks get you, your S3 buckets getting leaked, cryptojacking, because frankly, even if those incidents happen, something like cryptojacking is actually very recoverable. Like the way it manifests, the average cryptojacking incident, and I say average because there are 100 of these for every one that's major and takes over your whole environment and has a crawler. The average incident is a single EC2 instance gets as big a bill as it can run up. Or maybe they spin up 5 or 10 and it runs up a big bill. And that's very recoverable from a business priorities perspective to me, versus if you focus your strategy on other levels of defense in depth, you can then maybe miss some instances that are data exposure related, where I think that companies in the cloud really start to have business impacting issues are around those data exposure, ransomware, breaches, etc.
Yeah, that's if I was a CISO now and I'm moving to the cloud, I would listen to these last 10 minutes and just be noting down everything, being like, oh, he's giving it to me for free. Olav, we discuss this quite often. I'm probably more hands-on, more technical than you. You're more high-level strategy CISO type. I think you've even been a CISO, at least very close to. Do you have anything to add, or what are your thoughts about what Rami is saying?
No, I think it's quite close to what we usually discuss as well, to reduce as much risk as possible per dollar hour work invested. And that's usually not the sexy stuff. It's the basic stuff first. I think you said it really well the previous episode, Håkon. You need to deserve to work with the sexy cloud security stuff, or how you said it. Like, if you want to run fancy application security program, then fix your perimeter first. So, which is also what I'm hearing here. I think the only addition I have is, and I think Rami also mentioned it, but I really like to understand the business context and the business strategy first, because then it's so much easier for me to make it relevant for those I talk to. So if I can explain to them why security is important on their context to support their business strategy, then it's easier to get the backing understanding you need compared to coming in, throwing in a lot of technical details which they don't understand or care about. So it's able to switch to communication depending on who you're talking to. I mean, I also do something close to what Rami described, I think, when we get into a new client. But usually a client in Norway is a lot of on-prem, some cloud, some OT, some different stuff. So I don't usually do a maturity assessment, but I use the different maturity assessment frameworks just to go through everything, understand what they have, what we can use and try to get value out of what they have instead of starting buying a lot of new stuff at once, and understanding who I can pull on from the different departments to get help getting the security program up and running. So someone in network team is, let's call him a security champion, someone in the application team, someone at the platform team, then understanding how we can get those people working together to help you build out what you want to achieve, because at the end, you want to operationalize and democratize security as much as possible. And then you can't have 2 people working 24 hours in the security team trying to do everything. They need to go around, talk to people, get them to understand, help you do it together, which then, of course, comes down to what Rami said first, visibility, because they need visibility to understand what they should prioritize.
So having that relationship building as part of your strategy, is that what you're saying, Olav?
Yeah, and that's probably why it's so hard to be a CISO as well today, because you need to understand the on-prem stuff, you need to understand the business stuff, and in the cloud, you need to understand, okay, now we're doing a completely different thing, different operating model, working with, let's call it agile DevOps people with different requirements and expectations than those working on-prem did. So suddenly you have this whole big mix, and it's super hard to get it right.
No doubt. So, Rami, you mentioned 30, 60, 90 days, and you described at least how I would approach it if I ever ended up as a CISO. But what do you do post 90 days? Your board just asked you to create me a strategy. I want a strategy paper for these. Now you've had 90 days, you've influenced, you've made this better, but I need to know where you are taking us. What's the end goal?
Yeah, it's a good question that I think actually is something you need to be thinking about when you join, before you join. Frankly, it comes up in interviews, right? Whether this is an organization where board reporting and structured strategy is desired, or there are many organizations where the desire is to outsource security to the CISO, and they're going to push it down into the CISO seat, and they only want to hear if there's something business impacting coming out, whether that's a budget need or an incident. And so feeling that out early is really actually important, because it's complicated and expensive to develop a cloud security strategy, and it doesn't make sense for every organization to have a structured, written strategy. To give some examples, if you look at a lot of Chris Ferris's work from a few years ago, he was at a very big media organization, and so all of his public research and talks are predicated on this very big, very structured organization where they needed a big spreadsheet, right, to work off of. And they needed an ability to handle this heterogeneous environment with very diffuse responsibility. Whereas I also have talked to a lot of first security hires, written a lot of blog posts speaking to that persona at these small tech startups, especially in the Bay Area, in the States, where you're hired to make security go away for a while. And if you go into those seats and you spend 90 days coming up with, and I've made this mistake before, I've over-indexed on wanting a strategy, wanting the visibility to communicate upwards. And at the end of the day, it's like, oh, I spent 20% of my time on that and I should have spent 5%. So sizing is really important for the organization. Like Olav mentioned, trying to understand the needs of the business and just how the business likes to operate. So security is a lot of change management. Change management causes fatigue. It's hard on businesses. The more you can speak the same language, work in the same ways, the more you're saving their capacity for change management for other things. So that being said, 30, 60, 90 days, wrapping up, I want a cloud security strategy. To me, cloud security strategy really is just about giving a single model to consistently talk about your progress. And I don't care a lot what the model is. Like, the model probably depends on your regulatory and compliance environment more than anything else. And certainly those shouldn't drive your security program. Like, compliance is a great enabler of security, but compliance is not security. And if you derive all of your security from compliance obligations, you are focusing on potentially the wrong set of things. So in my past roles and in my experience talking to companies, there are a variety of maturity models out there. OWASP has one, right? I think it's Sam from OWASP. I'm sure NIST has like NIST CSS aligned models. I don't think those work if you're primarily cloud native. So if you are a cloud native company trying to mature your organizational processes by implementing a model, I wouldn't stretch all the way there. If you're an organization that has one of those models, your role then as a security leader is to translate it to cloud in a way that retains its value and doesn't distract. And that's its own challenge. But the thing I've used in smaller organizations, and I want to caveat really hard, all models are bad, some are useful, right? Like, use it to your purposes, use it as a shared language. I say this all because I'm about to tell you to kind of do a heat map, and heat maps are really bad statistics and really bad leadership. Like, they have a lot of fatal flaws of doing anything approaching a heat map where you try and highlight problem areas. But when I'm going into a new organization, historically, recently, I've used the cyber defense matrix a lot, which is NIST phases aligned. So it's, identify, detect, respond, recover. And then also asset domains. So it's data, users, et cetera. And so you get this, I think it's a 5x5, 5x6 matrix that at least provides some lightweight structure to slot in the work you're already planning on doing, right? You can say, well, our ability to identify machine identities is really low, and I want to highlight that, so I'll plot it on this matrix. And I also want to talk about how our ability to respond to network issues is really high. So I think it's a model that's so lightweight that you can make it say anything you want. And I think that that's okay if you are a experienced professional who just wants a communication tool. The problem is, what if you're not an experienced professional who just wants a communication tool, right? My perspective going into these is always, I mostly know what I'm doing and I'm willing to take on a lot of guidance and fit it to the business, but I don't need a set of controls or guidelines for my cloud security program. I need a way to talk about where we're doing well, where we're doing poorly. If you're building a cloud security strategy and you do not know where to start in terms of, Scott has the cloud security maturity roadmap. I gave a talk that says beyond the cloud security maturity roadmap. If you're not familiar with the topics from those in terms of the things a cloud security program normally does, right? We always end up building secrets management. We always need to think about moving off IAM users. If those are foreign concepts, I think a maturity model is actually your strategy often, because those tend to be more prescriptive, which has its downsides where you can take on prescriptions that don't suit your business. But it's empowering if you don't have the right context and background to benchmark. And always think critically about what things apply, don't apply, which maturity model does really matter here. I will say that Rich Mogul, who's a friend, has been involved in the Cloud Security Alliance releasing their cloud security maturity model. And Rich really knows his stuff. All models are bad, some are useful. I think that one tends to be pretty useful if you need to start somewhere. By comparison, AWS launched a maturity model, and a lot of us in the community provided a lot of feedback on that initially, because when the model is coming from the provider, there's mixed incentives. And that has improved and feedback's been taken on. But again, I think going to an impartial third party would be my preference. And if you pick a model, whether it's a maturity model or just a framework, you benchmark. And by benchmark, I mean take a day. Do it manually. Give me a spreadsheet. Give me a Google Doc. Something just to say, and this should be 30 days in, right? 36 nights, 30 days in, you probably want to map out where you think the posture is based on that visibility work. And then 90 days in is where you gut check your initial view. You should have moved the needle on one or more of the items you called out as really risky. And you now have a chance to revise your, how do I present this? How do I track this? Did tracking this work? Was it helpful? Is it really painful to map my program onto this model? Maybe the model's not the right fit. Was it really heavy to abide by the model? How did communicating upwards work around this model? Were executives able, did this resonate with how other executives communicate upwards? Did this provoke good questions that are focused on business needs? Or maybe we picked a maturity model and we have some executives who like to get in the weeds, and that's a bad fit because it plays into their worst impulses around rabbit holing. Or maybe we pick something that's really high level and all the other business units have something really granular and detailed. And, if the executives know not to get in the weeds, but they really want to see that we're breaking out the problems well. And so we need to go in that direction. So I think a model or a framework, think about your communications upwards. Think about how you use it for prioritization. Don't get too married to it. Make it work for you, not the other way around. And then otherwise, I think that strategy is about the people. People and tools, right? People, process, technology. And so this is all process focused, which is where I think you do start if you're going to talk about strategy. It's process oriented. On the people side, skill sets, right? Olav talked about businesses that are moving to the cloud. Look around. If you're coming in to do cloud security and you have no one with cloud security skill sets, particularly, okay, you can bring in consultants, you can bring in training, like level up your existing team, bring in consultants, hire new people. And then you have to think really hard about how you support your current workforce while you're hiring new people and making those meld well so that you're not having the on-prem team and the cloud team, which is an anti-pattern of talking to each other. And so on the people side, right, it's skills mapping and skills gaps analysis, it's staffing and planning for that. And it's all tied into your process and your tools, right? Do you have visibility tooling in the cloud? Do you have posture tooling in the cloud? Do you have response tooling in the cloud? I am not saying you need to buy every Gartner acronym, but I'm saying that you should look at what tools you have, what people you have, and what processes you have, and make sure you feel like your bases are covered. Because maybe you run a local script once a week that reports your cloud posture, and you have a staff member who's really good at that, and it is sufficient for your programmatic needs. And so you don't need to buy a tool there right now, maybe day one. But it's all about that balance. If you have no one who knows cloud, like, buy a tool. Buy a tool. It's always the trade-off is the cost of spinning up a program is going to take you so long that you really need something a little more opinionated and outsourced to talk to you about some of those visibility, posture, defense. If you have higher people maturity, maybe you can take a little longer before you change your tool landscape and focus on your processes, getting value out of your existing tools, value out of your existing people. So people, processes, technology, frameworks, and models. And at the end of the day, this is all about finding something that works for you, both in terms of prioritization, communication, and overall improving security.
I would feel so grateful being a listener to this episode. It's so much good knowledge coming out here, Rami. And I don't think I'm even going to bother to ask you, Olav, to get some input because I feel like I'm listening to you just with better English.
Yeah, much better English.
Better English and a bit more experience from other types of organizations like SaaS providers, vendors, etc. Just piggybacking off of this or going further. So some executive above you comes to you and asks, what's the next big thing in cloud security? What do we need to think about for the future? Because you've done such a great job on what we have now. Where are we going in the industry? And how can we ensure that we follow up with the same level of maturity?
Yeah, great question. One, I get a little scared. Because I don't like my executives wigging out about the future, right? I think that is something you should proactively communicate upwards. The strategy tip there is do not put yourself in a position where executives are coming to you with, hey, this vendor told me this is the next big thing, or there was a news report about microscopic bugs planted in hardware. Do we have to worry about it? Or whatever else comes across their desk. Be proactive about talking about past, present, future. But okay, if someone comes to me and asks me, like, next big thing, cloud security, the other call out I do is there was a really good talk at the most recent Mandiant MWise conference that talks about handling new technology. It was from the Google Cloud Office of the CISO. The names escape me, the title escapes me, but Peel can dig it up, or I'm sure we can shove it in show notes. But the big takeaway is, like, not everything new is new, and don't over adjust to some of this new information. The elephant in the room right now is AI, right? But a little bit before the elephant was AI, it was probably this push towards discussing non-human identities. And a little before that, it was even cloud security potentially. And so I think what I would say is that, like, the basics, when done well and when prioritized well, are there because they serve you no matter what's going on in the world and in your environment, right? Identity, network, data. They have, like, different representations. They have different permutations. They show up in different ways, but they're not necessarily, like, we're not seeing huge sea changes right now in cloud security, where I think there is where I think the gap is in topic, but rather in application. And so to, like, get specific here, getting the basics right is hard. And I actually think the next big thing in cloud security is that some of these things are getting easier and more achievable. Specifically, I think identity security is really starting to hit its stride in terms of tooling, automation. I think it's something where excess access, unused access, identity grouping, detections around heuristic-based identity cases. We're all actually seeing that like the technical tools we have solve these problems really well in theory for the most advanced users. And I see that trickling down. And so I do think that like identity is a place where there's a lot of worry coming from AI-driven usage, for example, right? Like agentic AI and identity. Like, do I have to suddenly pivot my program to handle this? Non-human identities and service identities. Do I have to pivot my program? And actually, the current approach to identity security scales through those problems. Maybe you want to think about your dashboarding, your posture, your detection around identity security with non-human identities, with machine identities. But you don't actually need to change your data. You don't actually need to change your controls approach, right? It's least privilege. It's always been least privilege. It's heuristic-based detection. It's always been heuristic-based detection. And so what's old is new again, I would say, is like AI is driving awareness of gaps that security people have known about and either been trying to fix or avoiding fixing. To me, the big two areas that AI is highlighting are identity and data. And data is the really big one. And I think is where there's still a lot of open questions on good approaches for data security at scale. I say that because data security is an area where the more you look, the more you find. This is true in a lot of places in security, but I think data, in my experience, I've talked to companies who think they're doing data security well, think they're doing data security poorly. And it's rarely reflective of actual benchmarking and much more about how hard they've looked. And there are so few companies that are really doing data security to the extent that I think they would feel comfortable publicly discussing the actual granular details. Like, you can look at it from the tool landscape. Data security wise, 95% of the data security tool market is visibility based still. And that's great. I think we need more of that. I think those tools are getting dramatically better, like applications of AI. Certainly, LLM for classification, I think, is a really good use case that improves on some traditional methods, and it should be paired with traditional methods. But we're still focused on visibility there. And there's a lot less of like data security posture tooling, and there's some data security defense tooling. So again, in those three categories, I think we're still building our visibility and our understanding of how to defend data. And now that AI is happening, it's coming up a lot more because you have issues around, whether we have externally exposed agentic interfaces, right? Like AI interfaces that have access to data, and we didn't realize quite what was in that data they have access to, and that's scary. Or we have a lot of service identities for our automation internally, and you hook it up to the big old S3 bucket and have to think about what was actually in there and who's allowed to have it and when, and monitoring this at scale. So new big things just drive visibility into some of these practices that we've been working on frankly, people have been working on for decades. And identity, I think we're further along. Like we have automated remediation starting to happen, automated posture. Data, we're still in a lot of focus on discovery and detection. The posture question, like there isn't a ton of automated minimization of risky data because it's a really hard problem. I think for me, and like this conversation, like let's plug our own conversation. The big thing is also how we build successful programs. I have looked around a lot at security programmatics in my year off, and I wrote some blog posts and talked about like how people monitor and scale their cloud security programs, their application security programs. And the security industry is new and it's immature. And I think as the function professionalizes, which has been happening for the past decade or so, right? Security going from a non-business aligned function to a business aligned function. We need to think really hard about like what successful teams and programs look like. And this is true in cloud security as well. There's a few like theses I have that I think actually align really well to like how Wiz thinks about security as part of why I joined. So like one, Olav already mentioned the phrase democratized security or to democratize security. And I love that. I think what that actually means is empowering local experts with shared and centralized context at the right time, at the right level of granularity, at high signals. So democratized security is the DevOps engineer who's actually working in the cloud environment, having the context served up to them to make the right decision at the right time, to fix something while they're already working. And this should happen from code to cloud all the way along the line. This is a downstream effect of a belief I have that whether it's true or not, a lot of security change is being driven by a belief that centralized security, a belief or fear that centralized security is losing function and relevancy. So again, the future is here. It's not evenly distributed is a quote I find myself applying to cloud security a lot. I'm not saying that like this applies to most businesses. I'm saying this is coming for everyone eventually, which is this move towards the developer being the owner of their code, right? Like post DevOps, the developer has the most context to triage and resolve issues. But this is true outside of engineering as well. Like your marketing team obviously can present huge risks to your business in terms of their data usage patterns, regulation, and they're also the best informed about what they're actually doing day to day, what their needs are. And so like, how do you serve your marketing team with the right context on data classification and regulatory relevancy? The owner has been pushed out to the edge in a lot of companies, and centralization is therefore too slow. Like this is the gatekeeper model we've been talking about for a decade, guardrails over gatekeepers, especially at the pace of cloud delivery, especially at the pace of Agile, lowercase a Agile. I'm not qualified to talk about capital A Agile, but centralization is just too slow. Things cannot do a hub and spoke model where security is the only organization working that way. And so I think that some of this like necessary push towards democratizing security, empowering users at the edge, guardrails, context, not control necessarily, is a necessary change based on centralized security, the wheels falling off centralized security. But I also think that there's a lot of thrash happening in organizations where there are centralized programs with long histories and a lot of success who are struggling themselves with change management, right? Like change management impacts your security team as well. If you're used to a gatekeeper model, it's really unsettling to move to a model with empowerment at the edge. This is companies who, for example, go from IT-based ticketing around identity and permission grants to just-in-time access, right? That's a huge emotional change if you're used to feeling that weight. And I think it's good for us. It's growing pains as an industry. Getting that weight removed, security not feeling accountable for every decision, but feeling responsible for providing the framework for the company to be successful and making security a responsibility of everyone, I think is huge. And also it's this like infrastructure as code is bringing code and cloud together, right? Your applications deployed in your cloud, it's all part of the same story. This context is necessary. What if your developers who were working on adding new application endpoints knew that the service they were touching was on the internet, right? Like in general, we like to think that they know whether what they're working on is internet facing or not. In practice, especially in larger organizations, especially in microservices, that information is often just like not front of mind when you're working. You get a ticket to add a debug endpoint, you go add it to the code path, you throw it up. And at no point do you stop and think about whether that's internet facing or not, or whether it should be. So this context being brought in is really powerful. And fundamentally, if we're going to democratize security, security tools they shouldn't serve teams. They should help teams work together better. Yes.
Olav, I see you have a comment.
Yeah, I'm getting so excited to talk now because Ram is saying all the things I like. So it's music in my ears. I want to say that what I've been seeing lately are that tools are getting much better to help you operationalize and democratize security and prioritize with context, including how to mitigate and harden. When you have that, you can scale security, you can work together, you can do less risk assessments and more risk reduction, so you can actually make a change. And what I'm hearing is also, this is connected to how you can do your security operating model. So if you have strong application teams that is interested in doing things secure, you can give them more responsibility. But then they need to have clear responsibilities, you need to have clear processes, and you need to have clear expectations. If you're saying what we've been seeing the last 5-10 years ago, DevOps is a solution, we're going DevOps. A lot of stuff is provisioned to the cloud. you come in and you look at it and it's just like, okay, who's responsible for taking care of these VMs or code or whatever? And they're like, I don't know. And you talk to infrastructure and they're like, no, that's the DevOps team. And you talk to the DevOps team, no, that's the infrastructure team. We're not patching VMs. So having understanding of how that should work together is, I think it's really key to like have your security operating model connected to the cloud in a smart way. And that also depends on what type of people motivation you have internally. Some teams might have need to have the central security platform team that decides everything and is let's say you need to go through them to get anything done. Others can distribute that super easy because they have more mature organizations. And I also I just want to add on something Rami said. I think it's like 15 minutes ago now, but just note it down. He said, we also see some consultants going out there just reading frameworks, asking framework questions without understanding the context. So suddenly the management get reporters like, okay, then we prioritize this, but it doesn't make sense because they only understood the framework, not the context of the client or what they're doing. So being able to tie all this together, then I think you can start to move really fast, really smooth, with high security and high effectiveness of business value.
Yeah,
5 cents.
I want to add one thing, and then I'll summarize on both of your behalfs, and you'll have to stop me if you disagree. But on the applying a model or a framework without the context, I also observe that a lot. I've heard some people referring to the model or the framework of the CSP as the Bible, and it's like, this does not align with what you are trying to achieve here. Why are you doing it exactly like the CSP is telling you? Because the CSP is telling you that due to those incentives not necessarily being aligned, they might want you to use all of their services, whilst you've said we're trying to be multi-cloud, use best of breed, etc., etc. But then to summarize, what I'm hearing is more of the same, just better. I'm hearing maybe in the future more of a focus on data management, and then lastly, democratizing security at scale throughout organizations and the industry. And on that note, I'm going to ask the both of you, do you have any closing thoughts or something you want to plug? No closing thoughts? No plugs? I'm going to plug on your behalf, Rami. Your blog is amazing. One of my favorite blogs lately has been on when to say no as a security person, because we're doing the guardrails over gatekeepers, but sometimes you actually have to say no. And how do you say no? So if you listen through the entire episode, go and read that. And on that note, thank you so much for being on, Rami.
Thank you for having me. It's great to join the crew.
It's been a pleasure, and I know this is probably double the length of our normal episodes, but I would tell anyone to listen to the whole thing, because it's been one of the best I've heard so far.
I'm backing that 100%. Thank you, Rami.